Good morning. My name is Lanisha Bosby. I'm one of the associate pastors here at Restore Waldo, and we are in week 3 of our sermon series called The River Wild. And each week, we have been looking at rivers in the Bible and the settings of their most incredible stories and talking about their meaning. And if you have missed the first 2 weeks of those, when our pastor Evan, who was just speaking, taught, I encourage you to go back and listen to those on our YouTube page. Those sermons are dynamic, and it is worth listening to so that you can catch up on this series. This past week, my mother had a birthday, and she is in the front row. Uh, so thanks for coming, Mom. The week before, I took her to a comedy show because I knew that I wouldn't be able to make the family lunch celebration that her and her sisters always have. And as we were driving home, I shared with her that I enjoy finding like new experiences that we can make memories with. And yes, lunch with her sisters is memorable, but I enjoy giving my mother experiences that I know that she wouldn't think of giving herself. So memories are important to me to make. Connecting with family, with friends, and even coworkers are memories that I cherish. This is here events that we attend that the staff here, we took a road trip to conference in Chicago. This is actually us back here at Jill Sellers' house. Jill and Zach Sellers. Let me put both of them in there. Conversations that we have and activities that we participate in are memories for me to look back on in life. See, all memories aren't always pleasant. There are some memories that I've had to reflect on that were some trials, some tribulations that were hard. There were discouraging times where I have cried, where I have snotted, and I was just embarrassed about. Those are memories where the Lord has given me grace. He's given me mercy and forgiveness and helped me navigate this journey in my life. And I've had to reflect on the times where the Lord brought me through when I've encountered some things that require more of me, that requires more faith, that requires more trust, that requires more strength, that requires more sacrifice, that requires me stepping out of my comfort zone and requires me to step into the next to form new memories. I've had some good memories and I've had some bad memories, and I know that you might have as too. Memories of love found or love lost. Memories of a new job or a job loss. Memories of healing in your body or a sickness that occurred. Memories of a loving church family or memories of church hurt in the church. Memories of new life that was born, or even memories of a loved one who had passed on. Memories of you getting a salary increase, or memories where you haven't gotten a salary increase in a couple of years. Memories of a road trip that was so wonderful, or memories of a road trip that did not go so well. Rather, our memories were a good experience, an experience that taught us some lessons, or an experience that left some painful spot for us. Memories are important to our lives. Joshua and the Israelites had this experience while they were on this journey, getting ready to cross the Jordan River. And they were put in a position where they had to reflect on their past and then form new memories. A significant moment had occurred in their lives in Joshua 1, where Moses has died and the Lord is calling them to move forward into the promised land. Joshua, it's an incredible book of the Bible. And in our teaching text, we are exploring a river that has powerful moments in Scripture where this river has become the setting for life-changing encounters with God. So today we're looking at one of the most famous rivers in the Bible, and that is the Jordan River. In Joshua 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, it reads, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them, to the Israelites. In that opening moment, God says something that's so direct, that's so jarring, that's so clarifying. He said, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, get ready to cross. Moses had led the Israelites for 40 years, and now he has passed away. There is this new successor who's going to lead the Israelites, and that is Joshua. This is how transition works. This is how new seasons begin. This is how faith moves forward. One chapter has ended, one season is over, one leader is gone, and one form of comfort is behind them. And now God says, cross. The Jordan River, it stood as this boundary line between what had been and what could be. It separated the wilderness from the promise. It separated the 40 years of wandering from the future God had for his people. And if you know the story, you know that this was not no ordinary crossing, that the water was not this shallow stream that you could just splash through. Joshua tells us that this Jordan was at a flood stage. The river was overflowing its banks. It was wild, it was dangerous, it was fast moving, and impossible for 2 million people to cross on their own. The Jordan River, it wasn't significant to them at the time, but this moment in their lives will make the Jordan River significant in a miracle that God is going to perform. The Jordan River wasn't a place that people would ask to go hang out at or to go and spend time there. It wasn't a water that was deemed to be clean or fun to be in. But in history, we see that the Jordan River played a significant role in the memory of others. We see in 2 Kings, where you see that Elisha instructed Nehemiah, who had leprosy, to wash in the Jordan 7 times. You see that in 2 Kings 5:10. And then you see that in 2 Kings 5:14, he finally obliged because he said, why are you sending me to the Jordan where the water is not clean? Then there's other waters that you can send me to? But they told him, what you got to lose? So what did he do? He went in down and dipped himself into the Jordan 7 times. And the man of God told him his flesh was restored and he became clean like a young boy. The Jordan River may not have been significant to the Israelites in a moment, but yet in the New Testament, we find that John the Baptist is baptizing people in the Jordan. They're coming to and fro, confessing their sins, and they were baptized by him in the Jordan. And then later in that same chapter, we see that Jesus came and he was baptized in the Jordan by John. And John is like, hold on, wait a minute. You asking me to baptize you? And Jesus was like, listen, we got to do this because we got to fulfill what God said. All right. John said, I'm going to baptize you. He baptized him. And what does it say in 16? It says, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. And at that moment, heaven was open and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. See, here is what is important. God often brings us to places where his will is clear, but the way forward is not. He leads us right up to the edge of what we cannot manage in our own strength. And there, standing at the water's edge, we have to decide whether we're going to trust our instincts or we're going to trust the voice of God. We're going to trust the prophet to tell us to wash 7 times in the water, or we're going to trust that Jesus being baptized in that river and the Spirit of God descending like a dove and hearing the Father's voice was significant. See, the Jordan River is about to become an experience that the Israelites will have this lasting memory. So as we transition in our teaching text, we jump over to chapter 3. See, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord would do amazing things among you. That is a word. Because not tomorrow you will do amazing things. Not tomorrow you will show everyone how strong you are. Not tomorrow you will finally prove yourselves. It says, no, tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. That's the key. The miracle belongs to God. The obedience belongs to us. And often we think that we get those reversed. We want to do this amazing thing and then we want God to bless it. We want to control the outcome and we want to sprinkle just a little bit of prayer on it. But Joshua, the people are told to prepare themselves, Not because their preparation earns the miracle, but because their preparation positions them for it. And that is true in our lives as well. There are battles that we cannot win in the moment if we have not been preparing ourselves in private. There are trials that we cannot stand if you have not been strengthening yourself ahead of time. There are rivers that you cannot cross if you have not spent time consecrating yourselves at the shore. Joshua says, consecrate yourselves today because tomorrow God is going to move. That is a before the miracle posture. There's a way of living that says, God, I believe that you are going to work and I am going to get my heart ready. And then comes the strangest instructions in the whole story. The priests are told to take up the Ark of the Covenant and step into the river first. We see in Joshua 3:6, it says, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass ahead of the people. So they took it up and went ahead of them. Not the warriors, not the strongest men, not people with ropes and construction plans, the priest. Why is that? Because the presence of God must go first. If God had sent the soldiers, we might have said, of course, strategy. If he had sent the engineers first, we might have said, that makes sense. All right, okay, I'm with that, God. If they had sent scouts first, if he had sent scouts first, we might have said, that's wisdom. But he sends the priest first. And this is the picture for all of us. When you do not know how to get through what is in front of you, you send worship first. You send prayer first. You send the priest, the presence of God first. You seek first the kingdom of God. That is why gathering with God's people matters. That is why worship matters. That is why scripture matters. That is why Sabbath matters. It can seem insignificant or inefficient. It may seem like you ought to be doing something that's more practical, more measurable, something that's more productive. But sometimes the most practical thing you could do is put the ark in front of you and say, God, before I try to solve this, I want your presence to go first. Because what happened? The priest stepped into the floodwaters. As soon as their feet touched the edge, the water stopped upstream and stood up at the heap. And if you think of a heap is like a pile of rocks or a pile of any kind of thing, sticks it stood up at a heap. When the priest went in and stepped foot into the water, that is wild. That is miraculous because that's not how river works. And that is precisely the point. Because if you're going to walk with God, there will be times where you have to forget everything you think you know. Because while God's ways are not our ways, he deliberately works in ways that force us to lean on faith. How do you cross a river in a flood stage? Apparently, you let the priest go while they carry a gold box. How do you take down Jericho? Apparently, you just walk around it and you shout. How do you save the world? Apparently, God sends his son. He dies on the cross. None of that flatters human logic. Because none of that allows us to be the hero in the story. But that is exactly how grace works. God's designed this mechanism of salvation and the pathway of obedience in such a way that he gets the glory. And we learn to trust. In 2 Corinthians 5:7, it says, "For we walk by faith and not by sight." So yes, to follow God, you often have to forget what you think you know. But that is only half of the message of this story. Because after the people crossed the Jordan on dry ground and after the miracle had happened, after the river had been cut off and the whole nation had passed through, God gave Joshua a surprising command. He essentially said, before we move on, go and pick up some stones. 12 men, one from each tribe, back into the riverbed, back to where the priest stood. And each of them was to lift up a stone and to put it on their shoulder and to carry it. Why is that? So that when their children later asked, what do these stones mean? They would tell the story of how God brought them through. In Joshua 4:6-7, it says, to serve as a sign among you in the future, where your children ask, what do these stones mean? You tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off with the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. And when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. And that is exactly what I want to preach about today. That you have a new memory. Because one of the greatest enemies of the life of faith is forgetfulness. The Bible is constantly telling us to remember. Remember what God has done. Remember his faithfulness. Remember where he brought you from. Remember the pit. Remember the rescue. Remember the promise. Remember the deliverance. And the reason we need that command is because forgetfulness comes naturally. We can remember random songs from 20 years ago. That beat comes on and you already know that first word. We can remember an insult in middle school. You ain't seen that person in a long time, but you remember what they said to you. We can remember when something embarrassing thing happened to us and we, and sometimes our family or people who was around, won't let us live it down. But we can forget the faithfulness of God with shocking speed. That is why memorials matter. That is why stones matter. Joshua wasn't just leading the people across the river. He was teaching them how to survive spiritually in the promised land. Because if they forgot how they got there, they would soon begin to imagine that it was them who got them there. And if you read the story closely, you realize these stones were not just reminders of a miracle, that they were reminders of something much harder. Because before the crossing of the Jordan, the people had encamped in a place called Shittim. Now listen, I did not say a bad word. Look at the screen. I did not make this map. This is a map, all right? You see that word? There you go. All right. And it's in the Bible. Before the crossing, at Shittim, it represented failure. It represented delay. It represented compromise. It represented wandering. It represented temptation. And it represents all the years that should have never taken so long. Deuteronomy says the journey should have only taken 11 days. 11 days! But because of their fear, their rebellion, their unbelief, and their disobedience, it took them 40 years. 40 years, y'all. That's a lot. That's almost my lifetime. That's not just a travel delay. That is a spiritual tragedy. And the worst part is that the biggest delay happened because when the first people first had a chance to enter into this land, they listened to 10 fearful voices instead of just 2 faithful ones. Joshua and Caleb, they saw the same giants as everyone else. They saw the same cities. They saw the same fortified walls. They saw the same enemies, but they also saw the same God. The others saw obstacles, but Joshua and Caleb, they saw opportunity. The other said, we can't. But Joshua and Caleb said, but God can. And because the people listened to fear, they spent decades circling in the wilderness. And here they are again at the Jordan, crossing into what the previous generation refused to enter. And what does God tell them? He says to pick up some stones. And it's so interesting to me because I don't think most of us will want to have this permanent memory of our most painful chapter in our lives. I think most of us will want to prefer to move into this blessing and leave the embarrassment buried behind us. But God does not allow them to do that. Because just because something is hard doesn't mean that it's bad to remember. And we need to hear that. We live in a time where hard and bad get confused all the time. If something is difficult, we assume it must be wrong. If something hurts, we assume it should be avoided. If something dredges up pain, we assume it has no value. But scripture teaches us a more way to think. Some of the best things that God will ever do in your life will be things that you would have never chosen. Not everything painful is good. We know that some things are evil, that some things are tragic, and some things are devastating. But even then, God can still bring good out of what was meant for harm. And sometimes the memory of the painful thing becomes the very place where grace builds its memorial. That is what these stones were, a memorial not only to the miracle of the Jordan, but the years of failure that preceded it, and to the fact that God still brought them through. The stones are saying, yes, there was wandering. Yes, there was some rebellion. Yes, there was a delay, 40 years. We admit that. Yes, there was compromise. But God has been faithful. And that matters because if you do not tell the truth about where you've been, the next generation will not know how to wisely know where they're going. That is why Joshua said, these stones are for your children, not just for you, but for your children. So when your son or your daughter asks you, why are these stones there? You can say, sit down. Let me tell you, because we didn't always live in promise. We knew wandering. Yeah, we knew fear at a time in our lives. We knew sin. We messed up a couple of times. We knew failure. But God brought us through. There is something powerful about being honest with your testimony. We do not honor God by pretending we're always strong. We honor him by telling the truth about our weaknesses and magnifying his strength. And that is why families need stories, not polished stories, not fake stories, but real stories. Stories about addiction that has been broken, stories about forgiveness that has been learned, stories about wounds that have been acknowledged, stories about marriage that have been rebuilt, stories about grief that has endured, stories about God's mercy when we did not deserve it. Because when you hide the hard things, you leave the next generation without context. But when you bring them into the light and place them beneath the grace of God, they become stones of remembrance. So what do we do with this? Here are 5 points I want you to remember. And I'm going to be quick. 5 seems like a lot. Trust me. First, we have to roll stones. We have to intentionally mark what God has done. We got to journal it down. We got to write it down, name it, share it, tell the story, build some memorial into your life. Because if we do not mark the places where God met you, you will forget them. And when I say roll stones, I'm not just talking about celebrating some victories. I mean acknowledging those painful chapters, honestly enough to say that they can be redeemed. You may need to sit your kids down one day and tell them, here's where our family has been weak, and here's where our family has been dysfunctional. Here's where we have failed. But this is how Jesus has met us. That's not glorifying the pain. That is testifying to grace. Secondly, You need to make a clean break. The people crossed the river. They did not camp in the middle of it. They crossed over. But some of us want healing without separation. We want deliverance without departure. We want the promised land while still keeping one foot in the wilderness. But there has to come a moment when we want to break camp and we have to say, I'm done living here. Joshua 5 tells us that the men were circumcised before they moved further in. This physical act pointed to something spiritual. God was cutting away what did not belong. And that is still what God does in our hearts today. There are things that you cannot drag into your future that God has promised you. Patterns, compromises, identities, attachments, excuses, or secret loyalties. There has to be a clean break. Not half-hearted Christianity, not 1 foot in and 1 foot out. Not God, you can have this part, but this part is mine. No, we have to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. Thirdly, you must prioritize recovery. After the people crossed, God did not immediately send them into battle. He gave them some time to heal. And this is amazing because Jericho was right there. The enemies were watching. The momentum was high. And God says, rest. That is healing because healing matters. So some of you are trying to sprint into your future in wounds you have not let God heal. Some of you are changing locations, jobs, and relationships, but the unresolved pain comes up every time. There is no honor in playing hurt. Sometimes healing takes time. Some recovery takes community. Some recovery takes counseling. Some recovery takes boundaries. Some recovery takes rhythm, sleep, prayer, and people around you. You do not treat a deep wound with denial. You bring it to the light and you let God heal it properly. Fourth, work hard. Joshua says the manna stopped. You can see that in chapter 5, verse 12, where the manna stopped. The day after they ate this food from the land, there was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. This is huge. Because for years, God had been feeding them supernaturally in the wilderness. But now they were in the land and the manna ceased. Why? Because maturity now has arrived. And it's time for them to plant. It's time for them to cultivate. It's time for them to build. And it's time for them to work. There is joy in work. God made us to work, to create, to steward, to build, to serve, to bring order, and to bring beauty into this world. Rest matters, but so does effort. God will not do for us what he's given us the strength and the responsibility to do. So yes, pray for your marriage, but also be kind. Be kind to your spouse, okay? Pray for your kids, but you got to put the phone down. You got to pay attention and give them attention. Children need attention. Pray for your health. But we also got to make some wise choices about what we eating and what we putting in our bodies. Pray for open doors. But we also got to show up with diligence and integrity. We got to do our part. Do what you can so our prayers can focus on what God can only do. Fifth and last, throw some parties. Because before Jericho fell, before the next battle, God had given them the opportunity to celebrate a Passover. That is so God. He brings them into this land. He heals them. He feeds them. Then he says, now let's celebrate. Because joy is a part of faith. Worship is not denial of pain. Celebration is not pretending hard things did not happen. But celebration is looking straight at that hard thing and saying, oh, and still, God has been faithful. Yes, maybe the anniversary of their loss is painful. And maybe the date on the calendar still stings. And maybe the memory still trembles in your hands. But over time, By grace, even ground zero can become a place of praise. Not because the pain was good, not because it felt right, but because God was present. And that's how the association changes. This may be the most important thing I say to you today. One day, by the grace of God, the very thing that once symbolized only failure may come to symbolize faithfulness. And that's what happened with the stones. Because Numbers 14 tells us that there was a day when the people picked up the stones to kill Joshua and Caleb. The stones were symbols of rebellion. The stones meant rejection. The stones meant fear winning. And now in Joshua 4, these stones have become memorials to God's people. It's the same object, but a new meaning, and that's redemption. And that's what God does in our lives. He does not erase the memory, but he can layer grace over it until once only represented loss also can be a story of healing, survival, faithfulness, and hope. You have a new memory. That thing that used to trigger only panic may one day trigger praise. That place that only spoke of humiliation may one day testify to deliverance. That scent, that song, that date, that location, that object, what once dragged you under, over time becomes a witness to God who carried you through. That is not automatic. That is not superficial. That's not pretending. That is the slow, holy work of God to a surrendered heart. And he does it. He rolls away disgrace. And that is what Gilgal is called. It means rolling. God rolls away the shame. God rolls away the reproach. He rolls away the disgrace. And he puts in place and he builds a testimony. So here is where I want to leave you. Some of you are standing at the edge of the Jordan. Some of you are in the middle of recovery. Some of you are in the promised land, but are in danger of forgetting of how you got there. Some of you have stones that you have buried, and you do not want to deal with them. But God is saying, bring them out. Let him redeem your story. Let him update the memory. Let him build a memorial to his faithfulness of what once only symbolized your pain. You have a new memory. Not because the past did not happen, not because the wilderness was imaginary, not because the failure was small, but because grace is greater. Because the same God who parted the river can rewrite the meaning of stones. And because in Jesus Christ, we are not the one who we used to be. So we got to let the priest go first. We got to step into the water. We got to pick up the stones. We got to tell the truth. We got to heal well, and we got to work hard. And then we got to celebrate loudly. And trust that God is still rolling away disgrace. That the river did not just open a pathway, but it created a story. The same God is still writing stories like that today.